Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. For 40 years, I woke up next to the same man, in the same bed, in the house we built together brick by brick. We had a garden in the back where I planted lavender and rosemary. Sunday lunches, shared memories, photos on the mantle, everything pointed to permanence. I believed we had grown old side by side, in love, or at least in mutual respect. Our days were quiet, predictable, and I thought that was enough. I spent my time cooking, reading, and waiting for visits from our daughter and grandkids. There was no luxury, but there was peace. Or so I believed. Everything changed the morning I found a strange perfume on his shirt. It was floral, sweet, nothing I'd ever wear. When I confronted him, he didn't stutter. He didn't explain. He just shrugged and said he had fallen in love again, with someone young, someone full of life. Her name was Camila, she was 20, and apparently, she made him feel alive again. My world crumbled in that instant. I stood there with a sponge in my hand, still dripping water, staring at a man I no longer recognized. 40 years erased in one conversation. He didn't fight. He packed quickly, calmly, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just watched him close the door behind him. It was like someone had turned the lights off in my soul. The silence in the house was deafening, every corner echoed the betrayal. I sat on the floor, surrounded by memories, asking myself how I had been so blind. I didn't deserve that ending. I didn't deserve to feel discarded like an old coat. But it had happened. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The house no longer felt like home. Every chair, every hallway, every photo frame seemed to betray me. I stopped cooking because the smell of food made me sick. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering how long he had been lying to me. My pillow was soaked most mornings, but I wiped my tears before anyone could see. I didn't want to call my daughter right away. I still hoped I would wake up and find out it was just a nightmare. But reality didn't soften, it grew colder every day. His betrayal haunted me. He left me not for another woman, but for a child, someone I could have given birth to. The humiliation burned deeper than the heartbreak. I wasn't just replaced, I was discarded. I had sacrificed everything for that man, my youth, my dreams, my body. I had been loyal through thick and thin, through sickness and health, and this was my reward. I couldn't understand how he could look at me, a woman who stood beside him through every hardship, and still walk away. The cruelty of it all made me question my worth. I felt invisible, irrelevant, like a chapter he was eager to erase. I didn't even want the house anymore. It had turned into a mausoleum of broken promises. I started packing the basics, not just clothes, but the pieces of myself that still felt real. A few books, a photo of my grandchildren, and the last birthday card my daughter had written me. I didn't know where I would go, only that I had to leave before I suffocated in that silence. The divorce process had just begun, and it would take time. I needed shelter, company, something familiar. That's when I decided to call my daughter. I thought, naively, that her love would catch me like a safety net. I was wrong. He didn't flinch when I asked him if it was true. He didn't beg for forgiveness or try to explain. He simply said, yes, and kept folding his shirts like I was just another noise in the background. I stood in the doorway, watching him close the zipper on our life. There were no tears in his eyes, only impatience, as if I were the one making a scene. He looked at me like a stranger, and I realized then, the man I married was already gone long before I found out. I had just been living beside a ghost who had already chosen to forget me. He left that night, slamming the door without saying goodbye. The silence afterward was unbearable. I sat on the edge of the couch, waiting for the sound of his car engine to fade. When it did, a strange calm came over me. I wasn't screaming, I wasn't throwing things, I was numb. I felt like a tree struck by lightning, still standing, but burning inside. All the memories, the wedding day, the hospital visits, the anniversaries, turned to ash in a second. I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. The air itself felt contaminated by betrayal. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching things we once shared, a coffee mug, his slippers, our bed. I tried to remember the last time he held my hand, the last time he looked at me with love. I couldn't. It had all become a blur. The woman he left me for had her whole life ahead of her, and I felt like mine had just ended. But I wasn't ready to collapse. Somewhere deep inside, there was a spark of strength, weak, flickering, but alive. I needed somewhere to go. Somewhere to survive while waiting for the pieces of my broken life to settle. And that's when I thought of my daughter. The morning I left was quiet. No neighbors waved. No one knew what had happened inside those walls. I looked back at the house one last time, not to hold on, but to say goodbye. I didn't cry. I had already done that. I called my daughter from the taxi and told her everything in the calmest voice I could manage. She sounded worried and told me to come right away. For the first time in days, I felt a small relief. At least someone still cared. When I arrived, my daughter hugged me tightly. Her children ran to greet me with squeals of joy, and I held them like lifelines. I sat at their kitchen table with a cup of tea while she listened, nodding with tears in her eyes. She told me not to worry, that I could stay as long as I needed. Her words soothed me like a balm on burned skin. I went to bed that night wrapped in a blanket of family warmth. I told myself, "You're not alone anymore." I believed her. I needed to believe her. In the first few weeks, everything felt like healing. I cooked for the children, helped with laundry, and even braided my granddaughter's hair before school. We laughed at silly cartoons and shared cookies in the afternoons. I wasn't a burden, I was part of something again. The pain of the divorce didn't disappear, but the love of my grandchildren made it bearable. I thought I had found my temporary refuge, a safe place to catch my breath. But peace, I would soon learn, doesn't last long when hearts start to change. And change was already knocking at that door. She told me, "Stay as long as you need. We're family." Her voice was warm, her hug firm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could rest. I placed my suitcase in the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply. My chest still ached from the betrayal, but I believed her words. She said the kids had missed me, and I could tell, they clung to me like I had never left. That first night, we talked for hours. She said her husband might take time to adjust, but not to mind him. I nodded, ignoring the small warning that flickered in my chest. The following days were calm. I spent my mornings washing dishes, sweeping the floors, folding laundry. I didn't mind helping, it kept my mind occupied. My daughter seemed thankful, and I felt useful again. Every evening, we sat down together to eat. The children told me about school while my daughter smiled, proud. Her husband, though, barely spoke. He nodded sometimes, said goodnight without emotion. But I convinced myself it didn't matter. I wasn't there for him. I was there to heal. To breathe again. To survive. Every time I brought up the divorce, my daughter gently changed the subject. "One thing at a time," she said. I understood, I didn't want to burden her. I just needed time until the papers came through and I figured out my next step. My lawyer said things were moving, and soon I'd know what I was entitled to. For now, this home, her home, was the only place I had. I trusted her. I trusted that she meant what she said. But even trust, I would learn, has an expiration date when patience begins to wear thin. Their laughter became my medicine. Every time my grandson ran to me with his toy cars or my granddaughter asked me to read her a bedtime story, I felt alive again. They didn't see me as broken. To them, I wasn't the woman who had been betrayed, I was their abuela, their safety, their warmth. We built pillow forts in the living room, baked cookies on Sundays, and made silly drawings that covered the refrigerator. They didn't know how much they were saving me. Every moment with them was a breath of air in the middle of my emotional drowning. I gave them my heart, and in return, they gave me joy. My daughter watched us sometimes, smiling faintly, but often distracted. Her phone buzzed constantly, and she seemed more tired each day. I offered to help more, take the kids out, cook dinner, anything to ease her load. She always said yes, but something in her tone had changed. She wasn't as chatty as before. The hugs became more casual. The conversation shorter. I told myself it was just stress. Maybe work was draining her. Maybe her marriage wasn't going well. But part of me began to feel like I was slowly fading from her priority list. The children didn't notice. They loved me with a pure, unfiltered energy. They knocked on my door early in the morning and ran into my arms. Those little hands held my heart together. They told me about their dreams, their fears, their school stories. I listened like it was gold, because it was. When the nights were too quiet and memories of my marriage haunted me, I looked at their drawings taped to the wall. It reminded me that there was still love in this world, innocent, true, and untouched by betrayal. If it hadn't been for them, I might have broken completely. From the first day I entered their home, I could feel his discomfort. He never looked me in the eyes. At the dinner table, he would finish his plate in silence and disappear into the living room. If I tried to engage him in conversation, his answers were clipped and cold, fine, no, okay. I tried to be polite, respectful, invisible even, but nothing seemed to thaw his attitude. It was as if my presence offended him. As though my pain was an inconvenience to him. I didn't understand why, and I never dared to ask. I began to tiptoe through the house, careful not to disturb his peace. I kept the television volume low, avoided using the main bathroom, and waited until everyone left to do the laundry. I didn't want to be a problem. I didn't want my daughter to feel caught between us. But the tension grew heavier every day. I saw it in how he watched me from the corner of his eye. How his smile vanished the second the children mentioned my name. I became a guest in the home where I was supposed to find healing. And deep inside, I started to feel like a burden, again. Even so, I stayed silent. I told myself it was temporary. The divorce would be settled soon, and I'd get back on my feet. I didn't want to cause problems in my daughter's marriage. I knew how fragile relationships could be, I had just lost mine. But silence has weight, and it was pressing harder on my chest with each passing day. I felt like I was shrinking, becoming smaller with every quiet sigh, every closed door. I never asked for much. Just a corner of safety while I rebuilt myself. But even that, it seemed, was too much for some people to give. It started subtly, missed goodnights, conversations cut short, a distant tone in her voice. I noticed the difference, but I tried not to panic. Maybe she was tired. Maybe work was overwhelming her. But one morning, she walked right past me in the kitchen without even saying hello. My heart sank. The same daughter who had once held my hand through fevers and labor pains now couldn't even meet my eyes. I watched her grow colder by the day, like something inside her was shutting off. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but I was afraid of the answer. She started spending more time out of the house, leaving early and coming back late. When she was home, her attention was glued to her phone or her husband's face, never mine. I became invisible in a space I once filled with help, care, and love. I kept making dinner, folding the kids' clothes, cleaning up after everyone, hoping she'd notice. But all I received were tight smiles and half-hearted thank yous. I stopped sharing things about my divorce, about my pain, she no longer asked. The silence between us, once comforting, turned cold. And I knew something was changing, and not for the better. The children still clung to me with love, unaware of the invisible lines being drawn around me. But I felt them. I felt the distance growing like a wall, one I hadn't built, but couldn't tear down. I started doubting myself. Was I overstaying my welcome? Was I taking up space she needed? The woman who once told me I could stay as long as I needed now left post-it notes instead of words. I read them with trembling fingers, swallowing tears I refused to let fall. I had come to her for refuge. But now, I was beginning to understand, I was no longer wanted. The change wasn't sudden, it was slow, like a poison spreading through the walls. I would ask, "Do you want me to make dinner tonight?" and she would sigh, barely lifting her head. If I offered to help with the kids, she'd say, "I've got it," with that tone that meant I should disappear. The sounds around me began to speak louder than words, silverware thrown into the sink, heavy footsteps on the stairs, doors shut with frustration. I started flinching at every small noise. I didn't recognize the home anymore. It felt like I had become the shadow no one wanted in the light. I tried to make things easier. I stayed in my room more. I ate later so I wouldn't be in the way. I folded towels perfectly, scrubbed the bathroom even when it wasn't dirty, made her coffee just the way she liked it, hoping she'd see I was trying. But the more I tried, the colder she became. She never raised her voice, but her silence was sharper than any scream. I could feel her patience thinning, like the walls of a dam about to break. I prayed every night for strength. Not for revenge, not for answers, just to not fall apart under that roof. The most painful part was pretending in front of the children. I smiled when I was dying inside. I told them their mom was just tired, that everything was fine, that grown-ups sometimes got overwhelmed. But inside, I was unraveling. I felt like a guest overstaying her welcome, like a mistake no one had the courage to correct. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't be long before something snapped. I just didn't expect it to come so brutally. Or that it would come from the same mouth that once called me mommy through tears and scraped knees. I looked up, thinking I had misunderstood her. But her eyes were stone. Her lips didn't tremble, her hands didn't shake. She stood there like a stranger delivering a message from someone else's heart. I opened my mouth, but no words came. The laundry slipped from my hands and landed silently on the bed between us. My daughter didn't flinch. She crossed her arms and said it again, slower this time, as if I needed help understanding cruelty. "You need to be out by tomorrow." I didn't ask why. I didn't beg. I just stood there, letting her words cut through me like broken glass. She didn't offer a reason, and I knew by her tone that it wouldn't matter. Her decision had been made long before those words were spoken. Maybe by her. Maybe by her husband. Maybe by the slow hardening of her heart that I had watched, helplessly, for weeks. I waited for her to take it back, to laugh, to cry, to say she didn't mean it. But all she did was turn her back and walk out of the room, leaving the door half open, like my heart. I sat down slowly, pressing my hand over my chest as if I could keep it from shattering. Everything I had endured in silence had led to this. My own daughter, the one I had carried, fed, comforted, had just told me I no longer belonged in her home. I stared at the pile of clean clothes and realized they were the last I would ever fold in that house. I wiped my tears in silence, not because I was strong, but because I had run out of tears. I had been left before, but this time it wasn't my husband. It was my blood. My child. And somehow, that hurt even more. The sentence hit me like a slap across the face. No warning, no shame, just those 7 words, spoken with a cruelty I never thought I'd hear from my own daughter. My knees nearly gave out. I clutched the side of the bed, staring at her like she had turned into someone else entirely. How could she say that to me? After everything I'd done, after every sacrifice I made for her, sleepless nights, empty stomachs, years of holding her together when the world fell apart. Now, I was nothing more than a burden in her eyes. Just another mouth. I stood there in silence as she walked away, completely unfazed by what she had just said. She didn't glance back, didn't soften, didn't flinch. And I knew right then that something inside her had died, or perhaps something inside me had. I looked around the room and felt completely unrecognizable in that space. A week ago, it felt like a safe place. Now, it felt like a cage of humiliation. Her husband walked past the door without looking at me. They had both turned the page, and I was no longer part of their story. I had been erased. I walked to the dresser and opened the drawers with trembling hands. Every fold of clothing, every brush and book I had placed there now felt foreign. I took out my suitcase and began packing slowly, methodically, one item at a time, not because I was calm, but because my soul had gone numb. I didn't speak another word to her that night. I didn't eat. I didn't cry. I just packed. And when I zipped the bag shut, I knew I would walk out that door without screaming or begging. I would leave with my dignity intact, because that was all I had left. I stared at the empty hallway long after she disappeared behind the corner. My mind replayed her words again and again, like a cruel echo that refused to fade. I remembered the day I gave birth to her, the way her tiny fingers wrapped around mine. I remembered her scraped knees, her broken hearts, the nights I stayed awake just to watch her breathe. I thought about every birthday cake I baked, every time I put her needs before mine. And now, she saw me as an extra mouth, not a mother, not a woman in pain, not a human being. Just a burden. I sat on the bed, clutching a photo of her as a child, the one where she wore pigtails and held her favorite stuffed rabbit. I pressed it to my chest like it could take away the ache in my ribs. My heart didn't just hurt, it fractured. I wanted to scream, to ask her how she had turned into this version of herself. But no words came. I had given her everything, and somehow, it had made her empty. Maybe I had protected her too much. Maybe I had loved her too deeply. And now I was paying for it with silence and rejection. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and watched the sky change colors while the city remained indifferent to my grief. The house was quiet, but inside me, there was a storm. A storm of memories, disappointments, and unanswered questions. I thought betrayal had already broken me, but this was deeper. Betrayal from a husband wounds your pride. But betrayal from a daughter? That crushes your soul. I wasn't sure how I would move forward. But I knew one thing, I wouldn't beg. I would leave with grace, and with what little was left of my heart still whole. I waited until the house was asleep. The children were tucked in, their little hands wrapped around their blankets, unaware that this would be the last night they'd wake up with me there. I tiptoed into their rooms, kissed each forehead, and whispered a silent promise that I would never stop loving them. I didn't want to wake them. I didn't want tears. I just wanted my goodbye to be filled with peace, not pain. I touched the door frames as I passed, trying to imprint the memories into my skin one last time. And then, I turned off the lights behind me and closed the door to that chapter. I walked down the street with my suitcase rolling behind me like an old wound. The wind was cold that night, biting through my coat, but I didn't feel it. I was numb. My body moved on instinct, but my heart lagged behind. I didn't know where I was going exactly, only that I couldn't stay. My feet carried me to the one place I had never needed to ask permission, my sister's house. She lived across town, and though we hadn't spoken much in recent years, I knew she would open the door. I just didn't expect how quickly, or how tightly, she would hold me when I arrived. Without asking questions, she led me inside, wrapped me in a blanket, and made tea like we were still little girls after a thunderstorm. I broke down for the first time in days. Not because I was weak, but because I had found safety. My sister didn't need explanations. She just listened. And when I finally told her everything, she didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said, "You're home now." That sentence cracked something open in me. It reminded me that not all love fades. Some love waits patiently in silence, ready to catch you the moment the rest of the world lets you fall. Her home smelled like cinnamon and old memories. It wasn't grand or spacious, but it was safe. She led me to the guest room, a small space with a twin bed, floral sheets, and soft light coming through the curtains. I sat down and finally allowed myself to exhale. I hadn't realized how tense my body had been until then. My sister brought me a bowl of hot soup and sat beside me in silence. She didn't ask questions. She just placed her hand over mine, and that was enough to make me break. That night, I cried in her arms the way I hadn't cried even after the divorce. The pain of my husband's betrayal had been sharp, but my daughter's rejection was a wound that refused to close. I told her everything, every cruel word, every heavy silence, every look that made me feel small. My sister listened without interrupting. She didn't try to justify anyone. She just said, "You deserved better." And those 3 words stitched something broken inside me. I didn't need advice. I needed to be seen. And she gave me that, without hesitation. In the days that followed, I slowly began to rebuild myself. I helped around the house, cooked with her in the evenings, and sat with her on the porch just watching the sky. It wasn't glamorous, but it was healing. My lawyer called to say the divorce was nearly finalized, and I'd soon receive my portion of the settlement. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a future again. It wouldn't be the life I had before, but maybe that was a good thing. Maybe life was just beginning to show me that even after being shattered, a woman could rise. Quietly. Fiercely. And on her own terms. The envelope was thick, the kind that carries endings inside. I sat at the kitchen table with trembling hands as I opened it, my sister sitting silently across from me. Line by line, I read what had been finalized: the house, the cars, the money. But what struck me most wasn't what I gained. It was the undeniable proof that it was over. 40 years of marriage reduced to legal jargon and signatures. I had cried so much before, but now, there were no more tears. Only acceptance. Cold, quiet, necessary acceptance. The settlement was more than I expected. My husband had hidden more money than he ever let on, and now it was mine. 3 savings accounts, untouched, each with enough to build a new life. It felt surreal, to go from sleeping on a twin bed in my sister's house to suddenly holding power in my hands. But money didn't erase betrayal. It didn't fill the void my daughter left or repair the fractures in my chest. Still, it was a beginning. A foundation. I looked at the check and didn't feel greed, I felt resolve. I could breathe again, but this time, with purpose. That night, I didn't celebrate. I sat on the porch alone, listening to the wind and watching the stars. I thought about what kind of woman I wanted to become now. Not the wife. Not the mother who begged to be loved. But someone new. Someone unshakable. My past had broken me, but this moment, this paper, gave me a second chance. I held it close, not as a trophy, but as a key. A key to a future where I didn't ask for space, I owned it. And without knowing how or when, I felt something spark again inside me, a plan. The check sat untouched on the table for days. It didn't sparkle, it didn't whisper promises. It was just paper. Cold, lifeless, and nothing like the warmth I used to find in a hug from my grandchildren. I walked through my sister's house like a ghost, helpful, quiet, invisible. I wasn't angry at my ex-husband. I wasn't angry at my daughter. I was something worse. I was numb. Like a woman watching her own story from the outside, unable to feel the weight of her own name. I had thought that once the settlement came, I would feel free. But freedom without love feels a lot like exile. I missed my grandchildren with a pain I couldn't express. I missed the noise, the chaos, the way they called me abuela with chocolate on their faces. I didn't miss the walls of my daughter's house, I missed the little lives inside them. I looked at my phone every morning, hoping for a message that never came. I was no longer welcome. I had become a shadow they were told to forget. And even with a bank account full of zeros, I felt poorer than ever. But one morning, as I sipped tea by the window, something shifted. I realized that no one was coming to save me. No apology, no letter, no miracle. I was the only one left to gather the pieces. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a curse. Maybe it was an invitation. I had spent so many years building lives for others, I had forgotten to build one for myself. That emptiness inside me wasn't a grave, it was a blank page. And for the first time, I considered what it would mean to write a story where I wasn't a victim, but the author. It was a cloudy Tuesday, the kind of day when even the sky looks tired. I was sipping lukewarm tea, scrolling through listings I had no intention of buying, just passing time. But then I saw it. The building. The exact same one where I had been humiliated, pushed out, erased. My heart skipped a beat. The image showed the familiar brick entrance, the little garden I once trimmed, and the same window where my grandson used to wave goodbye. I sat up straight. It wasn't a coincidence. Life was giving me a chance, and I wasn't going to ignore it. I clicked on the listing with trembling fingers. The price was high, but not out of reach, not with what I had received from the divorce settlement. My heart pounded as I read through the details. Unit by unit, floor by floor, I knew that building like the back of my hand. I had folded clothes in those rooms, wiped tears in those hallways. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. I wasn't driven by revenge, I was driven by something deeper. Dignity. Redemption. The idea of reclaiming the very place where I had been made to feel so small lit a fire in my chest. I called the number listed without thinking twice. My voice was calm, steady, polite. The agent was surprised by how fast I acted, how little I negotiated. But this wasn't about bargaining, this was about reclaiming something they thought I'd never reach for. I signed every paper in silence, carrying with me the memories they'd tried to bury. Within days, it was mine. The building. The power. The narrative. I didn't announce it. I didn't post about it. I just watched quietly as the ink dried on the contract. The woman they pushed aside had just become their landlord, and they had no idea. I had walked through that lobby so many times before, carrying groceries, school bags, and hope in my hands. It was where my grandson ran to hug me after school, where I once waited for my daughter to come home with birthday balloons. And yet, it was also where I heard the door close behind me for the last time, cold and final. The memories clashed in my chest, soft and sharp all at once. I stood across the street that morning, watching tenants come and go, not knowing their new owner was the woman they used to ignore. I wasn't there to take anything from them. I was there to reclaim myself. Quietly. Firmly. Finally. I moved into a vacant unit on the 3rd floor, not the biggest, not the brightest, but it was mine. The key turned in the lock with a strange finality, like the universe itself was closing a wound. I didn't bring much, just my clothes, a few framed photos, and the courage I had rebuilt piece by piece. I sat on the empty floor that first night, surrounded by boxes and silence, and I didn't cry. I smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time in a long while, I had chosen my own door to walk through. This wasn't exile anymore. It was return. On my terms. I made no announcements. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't warn her. I let the truth arrive in an envelope, just like the one that ended my marriage. But this time it would begin something. Something stronger. I contacted the building administrator and authorized a standard increase, one that would go into effect the following month. Triple the rent. Legal. Simple. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just done shrinking. The woman she thought she pushed aside had just stood up. And I was no longer asking to be seen, I had made myself impossible to ignore. The moment the final contract was signed, I sat alone in my new apartment, holding the keys like they were made of fire. I couldn't stop staring at them. These weren't just metal. They were proof. Proof that I hadn't been broken. Proof that I could rise. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with a strange, unfamiliar power, the power of being in control of my story. I hadn't told my sister yet. I hadn't told anyone. I wanted to sit with the silence of my victory before the noise of consequences came. I walked the halls of the building quietly, almost like a ghost revisiting the past. Every corner held a memory, good ones and bitter ones. I passed my daughter's apartment and paused for a moment outside her door. I could hear the television, the clinking of plates, laughter from the children. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand against the wall. They were still my grandchildren. I still loved them. But I wasn't the same woman who once begged to stay. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the one holding the deed now, and that changed everything. Back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote the official notice to every tenant, including her. No names, just numbers. Clear. Legal. Irrefutable. I placed her envelope in the mail slot myself and walked away without hesitation. I didn't wait around for her to receive it. I didn't pace or worry. I knew what was coming. And this time I wasn't afraid. She had made her choice when she looked me in the eye and said I was just another mouth to feed. Now, I was the owner of every wall that surrounded her. And justice had arrived. Quiet. Elegant. And signed in ink. The building bustled with the same rhythm I remembered, morning rushes, grocery bags up the stairs, children shouting in the hallways. But I stayed silent, hidden in plain sight. From my window, I watched my daughter leave every morning, her hair in the same tight bun, her face more tired than I recalled. The children still laughed, still ran down the halls with their backpacks bouncing. And I watched them with a lump in my throat, knowing they had no idea I was so close. I wasn't ready to see them. Not yet. Not until I had settled the weight in my chest. Inside my apartment, I kept everything simple. White curtains, one table, 2 chairs. A new life didn't need clutter, it needed clarity. I filled the space with silence and strength. Every box I unpacked reminded me that I had survived. I hung only one photo on the wall, a picture of me holding my grandchildren the year they were born. Not to mourn the past, but to honor it. They were my compass, my anchor. And even if I couldn't hold them now, I would protect their future, even from a distance. When the notices went out, the building shifted. Conversations turned hushed. Neighbors whispered in stairwells. And in apartment 2B, hers, I knew the moment she opened that envelope. I saw her hands shaking as she read it in the hallway. Her lips parted, eyes wide. Shock. Disbelief. And then the panic, the immediate rush to call, to demand answers, to find out who had done this. But there was no name listed. No warning. Just new terms. New rules. And for the first time, she was the one on the outside, begging for answers I no longer owed. I didn't make the choice out of rage. It came from a place of clarity, of understanding what I was worth and what she had done. The market justified the increase. Every unit had been undervalued for years, especially hers. I followed the legal process to the letter, with a professional tone and no emotional fingerprints. The notice was formal, typed neatly on white paper, signed with my full name at the bottom. I folded it with care, placed it in an envelope, and handed it directly to the building administrator. No drama. No confrontation. Just truth, finally finding its way home. Her reaction came the next morning like a storm slamming against my door, except she didn't know which door was mine. I watched from behind the curtain as she banged on the office wall, waving the paper in her hand. Her voice echoed down the corridor, frantic and sharp. Who owns this place now? Who thinks they can do this to me? I stayed silent, my heart steady. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing peace. She had taken my peace once. Now, I was simply reclaiming the space she never thought I'd have the power to touch. She spent the rest of the day trying to find answers. Phone calls. Emails. Pleas to the property manager. But no one revealed my name. I had set it up that way for a reason, not to be cruel, but to stay in control. The woman who once told me to leave by morning was now living in uncertainty, forced to face the same helplessness she once handed to me. I wasn't celebrating her struggle. I was teaching her, without words, without shouting, that choices have echoes. And mine, for the first time, were being heard through every floorboard of the building I now owned. I watched from my window as she arrived in a fury, still in her work uniform, hair undone, eyes wild. She slammed the notice on the counter and yelled at the building manager. This has to be a mistake. Who approved this? Her voice cracked from disbelief, but there was no answer that would comfort her. The manager remained calm, pointing at the contract. Everything is in order, he said, without revealing my name. I could see her hands shaking. For once, she wasn't the one in control. For once, she didn't know where to aim her blame. She stormed out of the office and paced the front sidewalk like a caged animal. Her phone was pressed to her ear as she made desperate calls, to lawyers, to her husband, to anyone who could undo the situation. I could hear pieces of her panic from the third floor. Who does this? Who buys an entire building without warning? Her confusion filled the air, but I stayed in the shadows, steady and silent. It wasn't my job to soothe her anymore. I had done that for too many years. Now, she was walking through the storm she once pushed me into. Hours later, she returned to her apartment with red eyes and clenched fists. Her children hugged her legs, unaware of the chaos. And I stood behind my curtain, watching not with joy, but with quiet justice. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply breathed. It wasn't revenge I had wanted, it was recognition. And now, without lifting a finger or raising my voice, I had it. She didn't know yet. But soon she would. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be me knocking on her door. It would be the truth, calm, unshakable, and finally in my name. I had decided to be present that day, no more watching from behind curtains. I walked into the building office calmly, right as she arrived once again in frustration. She was mid-sentence, arguing with the manager, when she turned and saw me standing in the doorway. Her voice faltered. Her breath caught. The color drained from her face. It was as if she were looking at a ghost, one she thought she'd buried under silence and shame. "Mom," she said, her voice barely audible. But I didn't flinch. I stood tall, steady, and unafraid. For a moment, time stood still. She dropped the paper in her hand, and it fluttered to the floor like a falling leaf. Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears that came too late. I said nothing. I let her look at me, really look at me, and realize exactly what I had become. Not a victim. Not a burden. A woman who had survived betrayal, abandonment, and humiliation, and still stood tall. "You?" she whispered again, as if hoping for a different answer. But I gave her none. Some truths don't need to be spoken. They live in the silence. She finally took a step toward me, but I raised my hand gently. No anger. No bitterness. Just a boundary she never imagined I'd learn to set. Please, she said, the first crack in her voice that sounded like regret. I didn't know it was you. I nodded slowly, eyes locked on hers. But now you do. It was all I needed to say. She broke down in the hallway, in the very place she once turned her back on me. And I stood still, not to punish, but to remind her that the woman she called just another mouth to feed had found her voice. She followed me out of the office, her words tumbling faster than her breath. I was overwhelmed, I didn't know what I was saying. Please, Mom, please forgive me. Her voice cracked with every syllable, but I didn't stop walking. I had waited too long, cried too much, lost too many nights of sleep to be moved by late apologies. Her hand touched my arm, and I turned slowly to face her. She was no longer the daughter who sent me away. She was a woman who finally understood the cost of cruelty. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. But she had. And we both knew it. Tears streamed down her face as she stood there, pleading not like a daughter, but like a stranger desperate to be let back in. The kids miss you. I miss you. I was wrong, she said, over and over. And for a moment, I saw flashes of the little girl she used to be, the one who clung to my leg when she was scared of the dark. My heart ached. Forgiveness had always lived inside me, quietly waiting. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It does not mean returning to what broke you. It means releasing the weight, without letting it crush you again. I looked her in the eyes and said softly, I forgive you. But I can't go back. She sobbed, shoulders shaking, but I stayed steady. I'll always love you, I added, but I've learned to love myself too. She nodded, defeated, but grateful. She understood that forgiveness didn't come with access. Not anymore. And in that hallway, where she once closed the door on me, I set her free, and myself too. Love remained. But the terms had changed forever. Because I wasn't just her mother. I was a woman reborn through fire, and I had earned my peace. Her face crumbled as the words left my mouth, but I didn't waver. It wasn't said in anger, it was truth. The only warmth I had truly felt in that house came from the arms of my grandchildren. They never looked at me with resentment, never treated me like a burden. Their love had been pure, untainted by adult judgment or pride. And that's where I chose to stay, in their lives, in their hearts. Not as a tenant. Not as a ghost. But as the grandmother who never stopped loving them. She nodded through tears, accepting the boundary. I could see it hurt her, but sometimes pain is part of growing. I'll tell them you're here, she whispered. They'll be so happy. That was all I needed. I didn't need gifts or apologies or gestures too late. I needed truth, space, and freedom to heal without reopening wounds. My relationship with her would remain distant, respectful, perhaps, but never the same. But with the boys, I would show up, fully, as I always had. Because they were the light that kept me breathing when everything else went dark. From that day forward, our dynamic was clear. I no longer entered her home, I met the boys at the park, at cafes, in bookstores. I picked them up from school with permission and took them to places filled with laughter. Our time together was ours alone, untouched by the past. And with each visit, I watched them grow not just in size, but in strength and joy. They deserved better than the cycle we had lived through. And I would be the one to give it to them. Not as the broken woman from before, but as the grandmother who chose to rise, and never look back. Every weekend became a new adventure. I bought a little car, nothing fancy, just enough to carry joy in the back seat. We visited museums where they pointed at paintings with wide eyes, asking questions I happily answered. We walked barefoot on sandy beaches, collecting shells and building castles that the waves eventually stole. We shared ice cream in parks, told stories under trees, and laughed until the sun went down. With every outing, I gave them pieces of the childhood their mother had forgotten I once gave her. But this time, there was no resentment. Only love, steady, simple, and real. I never missed a school recital or a soccer game. I cheered louder than anyone, clapped until my hands stung, and hugged them so tightly they almost melted into my arms. I kept a photo album of our days together, filling it with tickets, snapshots, and sticky notes they wrote for me. "Best day ever, Abuela," one said in crayon. That album became my new treasure, proof that healing was possible, that joy could grow from pain. They didn't ask questions about the past. Children don't need explanations when they feel safe. They just love, and I loved them back with everything I had left. My apartment became their second home. They brought board games, books, and even toothbrushes to leave in the bathroom. We cooked dinner together, watched movies on the couch, and fell asleep during bedtime stories. The silence that once haunted my walls was now filled with laughter and life. And every time they hugged me goodbye, I felt whole. I had been broken, yes. But in their arms, I remembered who I was, not just a mother, not just a woman left behind, but a grandmother who turned sorrow into sanctuary. And that, more than anything, gave me peace. Each check that came in wasn't just income, it was transformation. I didn't spend it on luxury or status. I spent it on memories. Weekend trips to aquariums, theater tickets for children's shows, new bikes, science kits, and art supplies. I gave them what their souls craved: freedom, wonder, attention. Every dollar became a gift, every outing a new page in the story we were writing together. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt fulfilled, finally able to give without begging for permission. Their mother noticed. She saw the glow in their faces, the excitement in their voices when they spoke of Abuela's place. She never interfered. Maybe because she knew she had lost something she once took for granted. I never flaunted my success. I never threw it in her face. But the truth was visible, not in numbers or property, but in smiles, in peace, in the way her children clung to me with unquestioning trust. I had become their refuge, just as I had once been hers. Only this time I knew my value. And I would never let anyone erase it again. Some nights, I would sit alone after they left, holding the quiet like a candle. It wasn't loneliness, it was gratitude. The silence didn't echo with sadness anymore, it pulsed with meaning. I had been discarded like I was nothing, but now, every laugh, every hug, every whispered "I love you" from those boys told me otherwise. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. On my terms. With my rules. And every time I looked around my little apartment full of drawings and joy, I knew I had finally built something that could never be taken from me again. I wasn't looking for anything. I had taken the trip alone to breathe, to reflect, to celebrate my quiet freedom. I walked through cobbled streets, visited art galleries, and sat in cafes with my notebook and thoughts. That afternoon, I was watching the river when he approached, elegant, silver-haired, calm. "Would you mind some company?" he asked with a warm smile. His presence didn't overwhelm me, it soothed something I hadn't realized was still raw. I said yes. And for the first time in years, I shared a glass of wine not in silence, but in laughter. His name was Gabriel. A retired cardiologist who had lost his wife 5 years earlier and was traveling through Europe to honor her memory. We spoke for hours about books, family, music, and healing. There was no pressure, no rush, just two people who had survived storms and found comfort in calm conversation. He didn't ask me what I had lost. He asked me what I had learned. And I told him about betrayal, strength, forgiveness, and rediscovering joy in the smallest of things. His eyes didn't pity me. They respected me. That was new. That was rare. We met again the next day, and the one after that. We walked, we ate, we danced once under the glow of a street musician's violin. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, not as a burden, not as someone's past, but as a woman, present, valuable, whole. When I boarded the train back home, he kissed my hand and said, "This doesn't feel like goodbye." And he was right. A few weeks later, he came to visit. And slowly, gently, a new chapter began, one not defined by pain, but by possibility. For the first time, love didn't hurt. It healed. Gabriel brought lightness into my days, not by trying to erase my past, but by honoring the woman I had become through it. We explored new cities with the curiosity of youth and the wisdom of those who had already survived heartbreak. In every cafe, he held the door. In every train ride, he held my hand. We didn't talk about the future with urgency, we simply let it unfold. We spent quiet mornings reading side by side, and long nights sharing stories by candlelight. He made me feel cherished without effort. And that was something I had never truly known. We returned to the building together one spring afternoon. He carried my suitcase, and I carried a heart no longer heavy. The neighbors looked at us with quiet curiosity. They had known me as the quiet woman in 3C. Now, they saw someone radiant, walking taller, eyes brighter, no longer hiding behind pain. Gabriel greeted everyone with charm, but never stepped ahead of me. He understood that this wasn't just a place I lived. It was where I had been reborn. And he never tried to take credit for that. He simply stood beside me as an equal, hand in hand. The boys adored him instantly. He taught them how to play chess, told them stories from his hospital days, and helped them build model airplanes. Watching them together made my heart swell. I wasn't rebuilding alone anymore, I was expanding. Not a replacement for what I lost, but a reward for what I had endured. Our dinners were filled with laughter. Our weekends, with warmth. And every night, when I turned off the lights, I no longer cried. I simply whispered thank you to the universe, not because it had spared me pain, but because it had finally given me peace. The news came quietly, like a cold wind through an open window. My ex-husband had died in his sleep, no pain, no warning. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel joy. I felt distance. He had become a shadow long before he took his last breath. I stood by the window and said nothing, just let the silence say what I couldn't. There were no flowers. No tears. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some stories don't need closure, they just end. And mine had already moved on without him. My daughter called days later, her voice soft, fragile. "I know I've failed you," she said. "And I know I can't undo it." I listened, not with anger, but with clarity. She had grown, perhaps too late, but she had grown. Our conversations became few, but respectful. There was no intimacy, no deep bond, just space, and a delicate line of civility. Regret hung between us like a curtain that neither of us dared to lift. I didn't force reconciliation. I didn't demand closeness. Some wounds heal into scars. Others remain tender forever. But with my grandchildren, my joy continued. Gabriel and I traveled, cooked, danced, and dreamed. I had love, laughter, and freedom, not the kind someone gives you, but the kind you build with your own hands. I wasn't the woman abandoned in a hallway. I was the woman who bought the building, raised her chin, and chose to live. Every morning, I woke up grateful. Not because life had been easy, but because I had survived everything that tried to destroy me. And in the end, I hadn't just survived. I had written my own ending, and it was beautiful.